Hi all, I'm AC Dodd and welcome to part 5 of the 1275 head rebuild and mods series. Right, we're on to the final stages now, and what I've got to do now after all the valve seating and everything else is I'm going to check the chamber volume so I can work out A, if they're pretty well balanced, and B, how much to skim off the head to get the compression where I need it. So in this case I'm looking for around 24 or 24.5, so let's go through and see what we've got. And we'll let the paraffin run in there till it fills up to the top. Make sure we get no air bubbles and we'll take a reading. This is number 2. This is chamber number 3. Up she goes. Okay, and we're down on number 4 chamber now, so let's get that one filled up. Okay, so that one's all filled up, and we now have a reading on all 4. Looking at the volumes here, chambers 4, 3 and 2 will look pretty even, but we've got an outlier in chamber number 1, so we need to look at that. Okay, so with all the chambers sized, why is this one bigger than all the rest? Well, there's a reason for that, and it's in the valve seat. So if you have a look at this chamber here, you'll see the inlet valve is pretty close to the top. You'll see on this one, number 1, it's sunken in a bit. And the reason for it is when I actually went to cut this valve seat, there was a small pinhole that appeared in the inlet valve seat. So I just had to cut it a little bit deeper. And it's only, well, so it's 24 thou deeper than the rest. And what that basically means is if you work out the volume that displaces in terms of moving the inlet valve down, it adds 0.61 cc into that chamber. So if you take that into account, you'll find that that's 25.2, that's 25, that's 25. This would then be 25.2, but because of that 0.61, it's actually 25.8 or thereabouts. So unfortunately, when you're messing around with production cylinder heads, you don't always know what's under the valve seat when you do cutting. So sometimes you can find a problem, and I did here, so I just carried on cutting. Now, with that extra cc make a difference? Of course it will make a difference, but it will be so small that the the performance won't be massively different. With that little tiny bit less compression on that cylinder. So we're not going to worry about it, but it's just one of those things you can come across when you actually do valve seat cutting on some cylinder heads. You can find holes or inclusions and things in the seats. It's actually quite unusual. I've only ever had it happen once in my whole career before this one, so this is the second time. But anyway, it's nice to show these on YouTube, because at the end of the day, not everything's always perfect all of the time. Okay, so what we now got to do is work out how much needs to come off the head. So the first thing to do is to get the head level in both planes. And as you can see, the level there says it's pretty good. So what we can now do is we can run in the required amount of liquid into the chamber, and then we can once we get the capacity we want in the chamber, we can then simply measure down from the face down to the top of the liquid, and that tells us how much we need to skim off the face in order to set the chamber volume where we want it. When you do this, you need to be quite careful, simply because that's a 25 cc chamber and I've put in 24 cc's of liquid, and as you can see, that's nearly coming over the edge. So I need a couple of spacers each side, and then we'll put the depth mic on and we'll measure down to the top of the liquid. Right, depth mic's on. You can't quite see it from that angle, but it's just come down and touched that level of the liquid, and it's reading 68 68 thou. Okay, so we measured 68 thou there. So the spacers are that I was using under the depth mic were 56 thou. So take 56 from 68 and we leave us with 12 thou. 12 thou is the amount that needs to be taken off the surface of the head. So before we do the skimming though, I'm going to now move on to setting up the valve springs to make sure that we've got enough poundage. Okay, so what we need to do now is to install the valves into the cylinder head and then fit the valve spring retainer and measure the seated height. And what I mean by that is the distance between the valve spring seat and the underside of the valve spring retainer, which is there. All right, so the idea really is we can work out what that length is, and then we can work out what our spring seated height needs to be to get the required poundage. So on this cylinder head, I'm going to be fitting a single spring because the rev range won't be changing out of what it's already designed for, and the lift won't be changing any appreciable amount to cause the spring a problem. So what we're going to do is basically go through the head, fit a valve in every single hole. We're going to use the retainer that goes with each single, each single valve, and we're going to measure that seated length, and we're going to write that down and take a note of it. So let's get started. First of all, starting with number 1, pop that in there. Now I use just a rocker spring and a couple of spacers. These are off of an old Lucas alternator, and then it just allows you to put them in and then quickly put the collets on like so. That puts our valve in, and then using a pair of dividers I can simply measure the height and then check that with my vernier, and that's 20.1 millimeters plus the spacer length, which is already in there, which is in this case is 16.3. so we have 20.1 plus 16.3 equals 36.4. so 36.4 millimeters is the first valve. So let's move on to the second one. Take the second valve, obviously give the seat a wipe to make sure there's no dirt. It sits down properly. And the most important thing is fit the retainer and the collets from the previous valve and take the appropriate ones for this valve, because obviously everything has a tolerance, so it needs to be set up so they all go in each matching position, so nothing changes from this build to the final build. Okay, so let's have a quick look what we got here. Now this is the valve that's been, number 2 is the one that's been cut a bit deeper. So I'm expecting it to sit through a bit higher than normal than the others, and it is. So we've got 20.3. So that's 36.6 on that one. Number 2 is 36.6 millimeters. That's about there. So that's 35.8. Number 3 is 35.8 millimeters. I won't show you the rest, but I'm going to go through the rest and then we'll see what the results are once I've finished. Okay, so going through the heights, number one we've got 36, 36.6, 35.8, 36.1, 36, 36, 35.85 and 35.65. So they're pretty close, and that's basically because we went through and machined all the valve seat spring depths to the same amount, and also 7 out of the 8 valve seats are all machined within a few thousandths of an inch of each other. But you might ask, why are they still different? Well, there's a reason for that, and that's because obviously I'm using new valves and I can't control the tolerances that the manufacturer has machined on these from the distance from that seat to the collet there. And also we're using, worn retainers, and these have a tolerance plus wear, and also the collets themselves will all have tolerances on. So the point is, even if you do all that machine to make everything the same, if you want to bring it right down, you still need to go through and shim the valves afterwards. So how do we use this information? Well, we just basically fit our spring we intend to use into a valve spring tester, and in this case it's got a scale on it, and I can read both the poundage and obviously how much fitted length I can dial it down to. So you just simply pull the handle by hand, bring it down to the appropriate fitted height for the item we're testing, and read off the poundage. So in this case we'll go down to the first one, which is 36 mil, which is there, and then we can see with that spring, and that's a factory spring, we're only getting about 63 pound, and the factory calls out for these to be 79.5. So in this particular case I'm looking anywhere between 75 and 80 is what I want to install them at. And so we can see if I fitted that valve spring on number one valve, exhaust valve, I'll only be getting 63. And this is where people fall into the trap of just fitting new components and not setting them up afterwards. So what we're going to do is I have a selection of shims that I can use here. I've got some fixed spacers, which are basically purchased washers, and then I've got custom ones which I make. So if we do need some custom ones, we can go to the lathe and make those up. But in terms of this, I'm not sure that we will, but we'll go through and we'll try each one. So I think it's going to be that, and then we'll put it back down to the appropriate setting for number one. As we can see, that one's come up at 79 pounds. So that's perfect for number one. After the springs and the shim get worked out on the valve spring tester, I then put it in the bag with the numbered retainer, so everything's together, and we know when we put that on it's going to give the required poundage. Once we have that work done, we have all the bags numbered 1 to 8, and in each bag you've got all the parts in order to ensure that the seated poundages are all exactly where we need them. Okay, so this is what we got now. You can see the original heights that I put her over on the left hand side. In the middle column there, that's the shimming, so you can see we've got different shimming, and most notably on number 2, where the valve seat was cut a bit deeper, we've got 147 thou, but on the right hand side is all the installed poundages. So now we've got 79, 80, 79, 80, 78, 79, 79 and 79. So out of that set of valve springs, that's all the shimming I needed to add to get the seated load where I want it. Now that's obviously the factory seated load. You have to remember that's on a new spring, so that's going to drop by a good 10% after initial 500 miles of running as those springs settle in. So they're going to come to just over 70 pounds. With this MPI engine, that's going to be absolutely fine, because we're not going to see much over 6,000 RPM with the way this engine's set up. So the single springs on this application are going to work perfectly. The other thing we're also doing on this engine is it's not going to be running 1.5 rockers, so 1.3 rockers won't require we fit double springs with extra lift capability. So again, these standard single springs, which are 12G1015s, will work perfectly in this application. Well, that brings us to the end of part 5. There's one more part to this video, which is part 6, and that will follow soon. But basically, this little section of doing the valve spring shimming and that, is it necessary? Well, I always like to say, if you want an engine built properly and you want to make sure that all your valves are sprung properly and all the loadings are equalised on the camshaft, etc., then it's worth doing. You will hear the difference. So I'll leave it up to your own mind whether you want to do that work or whether you think it's necessary. But it does get done on an AC Dod head. Anyway, hope you found that useful, and I'll look forward to seeing you soon. As ever, please like and subscribe. Thank you very much.